So the 17th century was a period of great transformations. It so happened that climate played a role. Climate change, we're only beginning to rediscover how important it is to global history. But climate change was important for what happened in the 17th century because the beginning of that century ushered in kind of mini ice age. And it's an important indicator of the ways in which the changes in temperature and rainfall would have important political consequences. Some parts of the world would experience great droughts. Indeed, as a result of the declining temperatures and the drying up of the atmosphere, some areas were afflicted by droughts, and as a result of droughts, a decline in food production, and as a result of declining food production, increasing famine and hardship, actually almost everywhere around the globe. This hardship would issue its spasms across Afro-Eurasia, with grain riots from China all the way to Spain. This, of course, was aggravated by the ramping up competition between the empires that were filling in those open spaces of Afro-Eurasia, with tax collectors in order to support these expanding empires, having to skim wealth off the surfaces of these societies and, if necessary, to dig ever deeper into these societies and search for more resources to pay for more war. So now we have a world not just filling in with traders and missionaries, but also filling in with expansionist states, their soldiers, and their tax collectors. All of this overlaid with an underlying struggle for local control, and in some cases the struggle over monarchical power itself. We can juxtapose, therefore, the kinds of conflicts that the Japanese were having in the 17th century with what was happening in England. The result was the rise of a parliamentary system in England, the triumph of an absolutist monarchy in France, and the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. What's important, though, for you to think about are the ways in which this kind of political turmoil had an underlying global and economic cause. For this emerging global system was also a very unstable one. The grain riots and climate change which caused them coincided with another shock to the system, which was the decline in the outflow of New World silver. As the Spanish in particular encountered more and more difficulty extracting silver from its American colonies, the amount of specie that was flowing into the circuits of commercial networks that tied the world increasingly together, the shortages of liquidity led to a contraction of trade. That, compounded with the fact that tax collectors had to, as I said, extract more and more resources to pay for war, was a vice on the system. Between 1610 and 1630, escalating Dutch and English harassment of the Spanish galleons to Manila hammered the Spanish ability to extract its silver, to plow it into its treasuries, to wage its wars. In 1640, Portugal would rebel against Spain and therefore sever the kinds of links between Manila and Macau in East Asia. The Dutch then blockaded the Portuguese ports of Goa and Malacca and isolated, therefore, Macau from its other Asian ports. It's very confusing. The point is that we have an escalation of the crises, an escalation of the conflicts between Europe over its presences in the outer edges of the world. This crisis would, in the end, begin to penetrate China. Remember that I had told you that one of the important pillars of the revitalization of China was this new fiscal and financial system based on silver payments. Well, the decline in silver output from the Americas and shipment to China would soon inflict a shortage of liquidity on China itself and cause a major economic contraction in this otherwise very dynamic societies. This would compound a set of internal convulsions caused by the shortages of food that I mentioned earlier. This crisis on peasant households living close to their subsistence level, squeezed by taxpayers, would lead to a subsistence crisis. Millions of people went hungry. Many died from starvation. To compound matters even more, as China suddenly forced to contract economically, put increasing pressure on its population to cough up what little surpluses it had for state coffers, now was threatened by another source of external aggression, this time coming from Manchus to the north. So here we have in China a classic pincer action, forcing, in order to defend the Manchu threats from the north, Chinese dynasts had to increase a set of really drastic, had to increase taxes drastically in 1618 and then again in 1636, all of which compounded the local social unrest. China then, under a lot of pressure, the Ming dynasty, now to defend itself, is faced with external threats and now internal revolt. Since many Chinese owed taxes in silver and their debts payable in silver, silver had become more expensive. They were unable to pay, but being forced increasingly by the state to pay. They literally, as in this case, famous image of a peasant revolt in the 17th century, they rose up against the Ming dynasty. In some cases, the peasant uprisings were directly against tax holders, but in some cases it was the spread of social banditry, what we see. On a massive scale, as peasants organized themselves in little informal armies to plunder wealthy landowners or the coffers of the state to try to defend themselves and to eke out a living. By the 1630s, this pattern of social banditry had begun to spread and became loosely coordinated attacks on towns, in a sense pillaging coalitions, so that bands of peasant armies, often numbering in the tens of thousands, became a standing fighting force, able to seize entire cities, some turning to systematic Robin Hood tactics to take from the rich to give to the poor, all of which sparked the local gentries to cry out for help from the central government, unable to defend them, and they began to organize their own militias. So you begin to see this escalating conflict within China itself. By the 1640s, China is in the throes of a full-scale civil war. So, like Europe and other places where we've seen this conflict intensifying, it's happening in China. The difference was, by now in the 17th century, the conflict in China was a civil conflict, in contrast to much of the European conflict, which was between dynasties. The result of the conflict was depopulation, impoverishment, the government too crippled to defend these outer territories. In some places, these peripheral regions got reclaimed by the very forests that had been removed in the earlier cycle of expansion, with ecological effects. The tiger makes its reappearance in the 1640s, what was once considered to have been extinct in China. As populations retreat from the frontiers, the forests move back in, and so do the tigers. All of this culminates in the overthrow of the Ming Dynasty. Lacking central authority, swept by a power vacuum, some rebel forces in China became so powerful they could defy the imperial armies themselves. One was led by a man called Li Zicheng, who was a shepherd who promised land to many of the immiserated peasants who were so disgruntled by the regime, and soon could sport an army of almost 200,000 soldiers. Li was an emblem of a new era, and he would spearhead a final campaign against the Ming dynasty itself. And in April of 1644, he would lead his troops into the capital of Beijing, upsetting the generations of Ming authority. The last emperor finally hung himself, and the whole defensive structure of the old Ming dynasty began to collapse. One by one, the old Ming armies defecting from the system. Now, one of the reasons why the Ming, in some senses, collapsed so quickly was because they were so busy defending the northern frontiers against the Manchu attackers. But of course, the crisis in the capital itself soon expanded this political vacuum, which put the old Ming defensive forces on their heels. Now, without a central authority to back them up, they were simply overrun by Manchu armies. The so-called barbarian armies swept in across the northern forces over the Great Wall of China, and by 1645 were driving the old Ming armies out of Beijing itself. So here what we see, what's important for you to think about, are the ways in which the political systems were involved in a kind of protracted warfare and increasingly reliant on a pillar to support them, which was the military, which itself relied upon the kinds of revenues that were simply not there as a result of this global economic contraction. So when the global crisis, economic crisis, hit, the crumbling of the army and the defensive forces of the regime brought down the entire system. And one of the things we're going to see in the ensuing lectures are the ways in which this kind of global economic crisis has fiscal effects on regimes that will eventually bring them down. And one of the in a sense, the lessons to be learned are the ways in which economic globalization can have these national political effects.